with Bubble Wrap by Dr. Prithviraj Bose.
Good morning, everybody. I'll be presenting on behalf of Medicine 3 and Medical ICU today about one patient under Medicine 3 who is currently admitted in the medical ICU. So this is Mr. R, 34-year-old gentleman from Satuachari. Notably, he does not have any comorbid medical illnesses and no significant past history of smoking or consuming alcohol. Came to us with a typical ILI history of 4 days of fever, cough, and breathlessness with no features suggestive of a cardiac etiology. So the presumptive diagnosis at that point was a respiratory illness, probably a community-acquired pneumonia, possibly viral. He came in quite sick, breathing at 32 per minute, saturating 94% on 5 liters of oxygen, afebrile at admission, but his chest was already showing bilateral scattered crepitation from the time that he came to casualty. So with the presumptive diagnosis of COVID-19, he was considered to have a NEWS2 score of 9 in case he was swab positive. The baseline investigations did not show anything significant in terms of predictors of disease severity, which we have classically been going by. His ferritin was elevated, LDH was also 965. The D-dimer was not as high as what we see in the very severe COVID-19, but it was above normal. The NLR ratio was 7.72, which is significantly high, and that, as we know, is one of the markers of disease severity. So he was swab positive, he was shifted to a level 2 ward, and he was maintained on supplemental oxygen. And because he had come in acutely sick with tachypnea, tachycardia, features of SARS, he was empirically covered for bacterial superinfections also, which is why he was on piperacillin, tazobactam, azithromycin, oseltamivir. And as per the results of the recovery trial, he was also on dexamethasone 6 milligram once daily, and low molecular weight heparin enoxaparin at 1 mg per kg subcutaneous once daily. However, while he was in the level 2 ward, he continued to worsen in terms of his tachypnea and his oxygen requirement. So on day 3 of his overall admission, he was shifted to the medical ICU with a respiratory rate of 44, and by now he was actually requiring a reservoir bag with an FiO2 of 1 and saturating 97% on the same. Although he was still afebrile, his predominant organ involvement was the lung, and it is for the ventilatory support and non-invasive ventilation that he was shifted to MICU. The rest of his course in MICU was unremarkable, except for the fact that 48 hours into the use of non-invasive ventilation, he was actually getting NIV with a PEEP of 10. The staff nurse early in the morning noticed that there was engorgement of the soft tissue of the neck, and upon examination, he was noted to have crepitus in the neck, the upper part of the chest. And chest radiograph was immediately done because subcutaneous emphysema was noted on clinical examination, and this showed evidence of a pneumomediastinum. So the first X-ray that we have, which was there on 15th of August, was one which was showing early ARDS with bilateral wedge-shaped peripherally placed patchy opacities, which are typical of COVID-19 and an evolving ARDS. And the second X-ray, which is on the right-hand side on 17th of August, showing that there is a pneumomediastinum developing. In fact, the cardiac borders are very well appreciated as the air is dissecting around the mediastinum. And there are areas of subcutaneous emphysema which are visible in the right shoulder region, in the neck region also, as air opacities and air densities in the subcutaneous region, which is not seen on the first X-ray. So at this point, the medical ICU team was faced with two choices. One was to bring down the PEEP immediately on the NIV so that it would not worsen the pneumomediastinum and lead to a pneumothorax as well. And the other one was to actually paralyze him and take over ventilation and to keep him on a high FiO2 low PEEP as much as invasive ventilation would allow. So whether to continue him on NIV or not was the decision to be made. And the team had chosen to continue him on non-invasive ventilation. So with the PEEP of 5, which is what it was brought down to from 10, the radiograph that was repeated on 20th showed improving trend in terms of the pneumomediastinum. So it is, what was interesting to note is that as quickly as within 40 to 72 hours, the pneumomediastinum had almost resolved. But by another 2 days, there was significant worsening in terms of his bilateral ARDS. So the problem that we were facing now was the fact that this was a man who had obviously come in very sick. He had all the classical predictors of disease severity in terms of elevated inflammatory markers, high neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, and somebody who had come in with an early ARDS and was obviously requiring NIV from day 1 of day 2 of admission. So the oxygenation graph, if we look at on the day of arrival, had a PO2 of 99. Then on supplemental oxygen, it improved to 137. And when he came to MICU on 15th is actually when he achieved a peak of 199. But immediately following the pneumomediastinum, when we had to cut down on the PEEP, his oxygenation fell back at the same time and it became 89. And thereafter, it was very, very difficult to get him up to the same level as we had achieved on high PEEP NIV. So this is the ventilatory strategy that I have highlighted here in the graph here. What he was requiring initially was a PEEP of 10, on which his respiratory requirement was coming down, his tachypnea was settling, and his overall FiO2s required were coming down. But once we came down to 5 and we held it at 5, we realized that we are not able to achieve adequate PF ratio. So slowly, gradually, as the pneumomediastinum was resolving, we pushed it up to 7. And then only about 10 days later, once there was complete resolution and he was obviously doing badly on a lower PEEP, we decided to push the PEEP back up to 10 again. So the resultant PF ratios, if we look at, has shown a steep decline from 236 to 199 to a sharp drop as soon as the PEEP came down. And thereafter, it has never quite recovered except for one EBG here, which appears to be an outlier. Which shows that the trend is of a worsening ARDS, and it is the ARDS itself and not probably the pneumomediastinum or the pneumothorax that has contributed to his respiratory worsening. Subsequently, what happened was that, so this is something I discussed already, there was a conscious decision taken not to intubate him and take over ventilation, so we continued on NIV. And although the pneumomediastinum resolved, it was the ARDS that worsened subsequently in the next 48 hours. So is this the only patient who we have seen with a similar clinical disease? So this is the second patient under medicine 3 itself. And what is alarming is that this is a gentleman who had no comorbid illnesses. He had no underlying structural heart or lung disease. And the other man also was a similar patient with no comorbidities. The only comorbidity that the other person had was a recently detected diabetes, no underlying structural lung disease, not a smoker. And these are people who went on to have the spontaneous pneumomediastinum. Not even an elderly person. So what is worrying is that we do not know exactly what has caused it. The previous patient who had a similar disease now has expired, and our current patient also is not doing very well in terms of a worsening ARDS. So we wanted to look up the literature from around the world to see how common this is, and if this kind of a spontaneous pneumomediastinum is in some way different from similar things that we had seen with the 2009 H1N1 pandemic and other known viral influenzas, where we know that a high PEEP ventilation can predispose one to pneumomediastinum and pneumothorax. So we have multiple case reports. Actually, the most recent one is from a BMJ case report, where they have also described a patient with notably no history of pulmonary disease, pneumothorax or tobacco use, never required mechanical intubation. So he had a spontaneous pneumomediastinum in the same way, and the group that treated him from the US also reported that this is a rare condition which can happen in patients with no underlying pulmonary pathologies. What has exactly caused it is also not very clear, but what one should know is that when a person has an unexplained worsening, it is not always attributable to a worsening ARDS in COVID, and we need to look for other causes as well. And this pneumomediastinum with a subsequent pneumothorax may be one of these. So then after this, we also had another report coming from Wuhan, where they reported a 38-year-old man who was not even on NIV. And this is more surprising because this man was never on high PEEP ventilation, but on day 11, he had exertional angina, palpitations and wheezing, and CT revealed these ground glass opacities, which was suggestive of a spontaneous pneumomediastinum developing along with the ARDS worsening. Clinically also, he had a subcutaneous emphysema. Again, we do not know exactly what caused this patient to develop on pneumomediastinum, especially considering that he was not on high PEEP ventilation. So this was followed by an even more alarming report where a 23-year-old lady who was not even symptomatic for the disease was admitted for an asymptomatic infection in a hospital in Morocco, was also found to have a pneumomediastinum. In fact, she never required oxygen. Her vital signs were stable with a saturation of 98%, but then she subsequently went on to develop the spontaneous pneumomediastinum. So what has been described as a hypothesis, though not entirely proven, is that there is a pressure gradient which is created between the alveolus and the lung interstitium, which is why the air dissects through the alveolus and enters the interstitium, thereafter spreads around the venous sheaths of the mediastinum, encasing the great vessels, and thereby giving the typical appearance of a pneumomediastinum. What is causing this? Either there has to be an increase in the pressure on the alveolar side, or there has to be a sudden reduction in the pressure on the interstitial side. So simulations of the Valsalva maneuver, like coughing, sneezing, defecation, or extremes of respiratory effort can bring about this kind of a scenario. But this by itself would not be adequate to explain how people who were not on high PEEP ventilation went on to develop something like this, which means that there is something that is weakening the alveolar interstitial interface, which is what is described in COVID-19, is that maybe the viral infection itself, because one is that it is shown to infect both the type 1 and the type 2 pneumocytes, because of which the surfactant production may not be adequate, and that may be one of the contributory causes to why the mechanical strength of this alveolo-interstitial barrier breaks down, and after that I guess it would require the patient to cough or have a effortful expiration to develop a spontaneous pneumomediastinum. So there was these are the only case reports that we have, and there is just one case series where they have reported about 7 cases who went on to develop similar disease in the course of care for COVID-19. So this was 7 patients in whom the incidence was found to be a very small number, actually only 0.72%, and there were actually no predictors of what made these people develop the pneumomediastinum and allow us to understand these are risk factors for this complication. The event onset, as you can see, is 9 plus minus 9 days, which really doesn't predict anything. 5 out of the 7 patients subsequently required intubation, but all the pneumomediastinum and the pneumothorax events had occurred before the intubation itself. If intubation happened, it was subsequent to the development of this complication. There was no difference in age, gender, BMI, medical histories compared to other COVID-19 patients, except for 3 patients who had bronchial asthma. 1 out of 7 spontaneous air leak patients expired, and 5 out of 6 discharged patients had a resolution of their air leak. All 10 patients with an air leak which persisted after intubation expired. So this is the profile of all 7 patients. If you look at it, it's a very heterogeneous group. There are those who were not intubated and those who subsequently required intubation for the management of the pneumomediastinum as well. If you look at whether the pneumomediastinum was accompanied by a pneumothorax or not, out of this there was about 3 patients out of 7 who subsequently developed pneumothorax as well. And again, very heterogeneous in terms of when the event occurred in the time of the illness as well, with regards to 1, 2, 3 being on day 0, while the others being on day 10 and day 15. Effortful cough was noted significant in 6 out of 7 patients, and the smoking status, interestingly, was negative for 6 out of 7 patients. Bronchial asthma was seen in 3 out of 7 patients, and there was nothing else, even in terms of the lactates, that we could use as a predictor of severity of disease. CT findings were mostly similar for all of them. Interestingly, half of them required chest tube placement, half of them did not. And air leak radiological resolution was seen in almost all the patients. So what went on to kill the patients was probably complications of ARDS and not the pneumomediastinum itself. So what can we learn from this experience? One is that the entity itself, spontaneous pneumomediastinum and COVID-19, can also happen outside the context of high PEEP, NIV, or invasive ventilation, and may be an additional cause of mortality and morbidity. This complication seems to affect young patients as well, with no underlying structural lung disease. The cause of the worsening gas exchange, from our experience in the medical ICU, appears to be the forced lowering of PEEP in order to make sure the pneumomediastinum doesn't worsen, and not the disease itself. Since the entity has been described in people not on positive pressure ventilation, we don't know exactly what is causing it. So this warrants further research in the area and for us to be aware of this potential complication.
Thank you, Prithvi. Just a few questions. The pathophysiology which you mentioned, the difference between the pressure gradient in the alveoli and the interstitium, shouldn't that predispose more to pneumothorax rather than why do they have classically pneumomediastinum rather than pneumothorax?
I'm not sure of the answer to that question, but what they are saying is that once the air enters the interstitium, it collects along the lymphatic drainage and goes into the mediastinum thereafter. Only when it will breach the visceral pleura is when it will actually cause a pneumothorax. So I don't think that the pressure gradient is enough to breach the visceral pleura itself, but that the air dissects along the lines of the interstitium and thereafter is collected by the lymphatics to the sheath of the great vessels. But what causes it to transition from one to the other, I'm not sure. This is all that I could find in terms of the mechanism.
And second question is, in patients who you need high pressure, high oxygenation for the underlying COVID ARDS, but cannot give for the pneumomediastinum, what can we use ECMO?
So I discussed, I don't know if they have tried it or not, but when I discussed with Dr. Binila, what she felt is that if we do use ECMO in that context, it would only be in terms of being bridge therapy to lung transplant. That's what ma'am feels. Because the ECMO itself is not going to cause a reduction in the severity of the disease, and once it takes its course and fibrotic ARDS develops, then it's unlikely that the patient will get well without a lung transplant.
Any other questions from anyone? Any comments? Anand sir has written the mediastinal emphysema may be indicative of decreased lung compliance and increased lung stiffness. It may indicate risk for developing pneumothorax. The patient may not improve quickly.
Actually, we have, in addition to the M2 patients, we have another 3, I think, from M1, and overall the ICU feels that may be reaching double digits also now, the number of patients who developed this complication.
Anand sir, do you want to say something, sir? If there are no further questions or comments, can we? Sorry, sir. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so it's becoming a real problem. So the most recent case was a gentleman who'd come in and was put on NIV, had pneumomediastinum, and was tubed and developed bilateral pneumothorax and died very soon after that. So there's another patient in AICU right now who has a pneumomediastinum. He's been on NIV now for a week. He's not improving therapy. Mediastinal emphysema seems to indicate not a good prognosis as far as the ventilation is concerned. And obviously the lung is stiff, air is leaking along the alveoli and going into the mediastinum without producing an overt pneumothorax. This is seen in other severe forms of pneumonia, but occasionally. But in something is happening in COVID pneumonia, which is increasing the risk for mediastinal emphysema, not as commonly as seen in other pneumonias. I finished.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir. We'll now move on to the next presentation from Medicine One, a novel association by Dr. Jim, and neurology will also be presenting with them.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm presenting on behalf of Medicine One. We had a recent patient presenting the case of Mr. N, who's from Kadapa. He's a 62-year-old gentleman who had come with history of fever with chills and rigors for 2 days with malaise and myalgia. He had a mild cough with mucoid sputum and mild breathlessness, the NHI class 2 for 2 days. He also said that he had associated numbness and heaviness felt of bilateral lower limb for 1 day prior to admission. He had no chest pain or deep inspiration or no other symptoms of sore throat or nasal congestion, no loose stools or vomiting, no headache or altered sensorium before presentation. He's a diabetic for 12 years and is controlled with oral anti-diabetic medication. He has no addictions. On the 12th of August, he had presented to CMC, and on that day in the emergency, he was found to have a blood pressure of 150/90 with a respiratory rate of 36, a pulse rate of 80. He was afebrile at that point of time, but however required 5 liters of oxygen to maintain a saturation of 94%. However, it was noted to have he had a single breath count of 9 at that point of time. However, he was maintaining saturation and on 5 liters of oxygen. His JVP was not elevated. He did not have any pallor or icterus or pedal edema at that point of time. His cardiovascular respiratory and abdominal examination was unremarkable at the time of admission. There is no documented evidence of any weakness or sensory findings at the time of admission in the casualty. So he was admitted as a case of influenza-like illness with for 2 days, probably COVID-19 or other viral or bacterial etiology, and he was admitted for screening and was positive on the same day and was shifted to level 2 for further management in view of oxygen requirement. In initial evaluation, he had a PF ratio of 290 and his X-ray showed mild infiltrates in bilateral upper, mid and lower zones. Initial evaluation showed hemoglobin of 14.6. He had leukocytosis with neutrophilic predominance, and in the renal function he had a renal dysfunction of creat of 1.73. The LFT was nearly normal, electrolytes and however initially the LDH was 350, the ferritin was mildly elevated to be 816, the D-dimer was 15,840, CRP was 24 and ESR was 5. However, on the next day in the ward, when he woke up, he noticed that he was unable to move his both lower limbs, and again he felt really heavy, and he found difficult to turn sideways, and he had difficulty in lifting his head above the pillow. He did not have any weakness of the upper limb at that point of time, no visual or facial symptoms at that time. He did not have any altered sensorium or seizures at point of time. And he also felt that within 2 hours he found straining to void, and he developed a painless retention on the day 2 of admission. He did not have any of this neurological symptoms in the past. And on the day 1 in the ward, when he developed these symptoms, again his consciousness, he was conscious and cooperative with blood pressure of 150/50, heart rate of 90. He was afebrile and respiratory rate was 24. The single breath count was 18. Cranial nerve examination on the first day did not reveal any significant abnormality. There was reduced. He had a reduced tone in the bilateral lower limbs with weakness in the neck flexors, and there was evidence of truncal weakness. However, there is no weakness that was found in the upper limbs, and there was impairment in the joint position sensation up to the level of hips. However, they were not able to see a definitive sensory level. And there was absent reflexes in the knee and ankle joints, and however the reflexes are present in the supinated triceps and biceps, and he had an upgoing plantar bilaterally with there is no evidence of any spine tenderness or any other meningeal signs. So after the development of new symptoms in the ward, he developed the acute onset paraparesis with sensory symptoms and bladder dysfunction. However, the localization, he had a bipyramidal involvement with highest motor level being the neck flexor weakness, and there was posterior column involvement and bladder dysfunction. So it was clinically a longitudinally extensive lesion in the spinal cord, the cervicodorsal cord. There could be a doubtful probable lower motor neuron weakness because of the tone was less and the reflexes were absent. And subsequently, the next day he had aspirated after the breakfast, and he became further dyspneic with increase in oxygen requirements. His tone of voice was noted to be decreased, and there was pooling of secretions well. And on examination, he had a weak gag, and he was dysarthric and dysphonic. However, he did not have any other cranial nerve involvement from the two, or the extraocular movements were normal, and at that point of the differentials considered for him with this new symptoms were with the clinical localization of a longitudinally extensive transverse myelitis, thought of an acute disseminated encephalomyelitis or a NMO spectrum disorder, multiple sclerosis, atypical presentation of a Guillain-Barré syndrome secondary to COVID, the current COVID-19 infection, However, causes like an acute meningoencephalitis or a paraneoplastic or autoimmune encephalomyelitis was unlikely because of the onset of symptoms and the symptoms and signs. So he was further evaluated. His CSF was done, which showed cells of 28 with lymphocytic pleocytosis. However, his protein was elevated. It's 173. Had a normal glucose corresponding to his GRBS levels. An urgent MRI whole spine imaging was done, which showed a longitudinally extensive transverse myelitis extending from the level C6 to the level of conus. And some MRI brain was done along, and it showed a focal area of T2 weighted hyperintensity in the middle cerebellar peduncle with extension to the pons and midbrain, which is suggestive of demyelination. So, looking for other causes of demyelination or similar lesions, we had sent a NMO spectrum disease antibody screening, which is negative for both MOG and aquaporin 4. Since this the CSF report was inconclusive with there was some lymphocytic pleocytosis, we had sent a viral multiplex PCR, which is negative. The cultures from the CSF were negative. See, there was no evidence of any atypical cells in the CSF. Oligoclonal bands is awaited as till date, and we had sent a CSF COVID PCR, which is also awaited. The other autoimmune workup that was sent was within normal limits. However, EMGNC was not done. On the next day, he was started on considering a diagnosis of acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, probably associated with COVID, ruling out other causes. Anyway, he was started on injection methylprednisolone 1 gram planned for 5 days. At that time, he did not have any fever spike or any other features of SIRS. Initial blood culture that had sent was shown there was no growth till then. After 1 day of methylprednisolone, he developed dysarthria, and the dysarthria and dysphonia was better, and he was able to speak in complete sentences. Subsequently, there was mild improvement in bulbar symptoms, but however, there was no improvement in the lower limb weakness. On 19th, he has completed the 5 days of methylprednisolone therapy, and there was no further new symptoms, no new symptoms. However, even though the bulbar symptoms improved, there was no significant improvement in the lower limb weakness. And he was also stopped on oxygen after the completion of the pulsing. So we had diagnosed acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, having a longitudinally extending transverse myelitis with multi-level demyelination. And what we want to discuss was the possible COVID-19 association with the ADEM, or acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. So we know the neurological, there are varied neurological manifestations that can happen with COVID-19, ranging from headache, anosmia, ageusia, impaired consciousness, because can be due to toxic metabolic encephalopathies. If there is a associated seizure, stroke and vascular syndromes have been reported because of the procoagulant or the dysregulated coagulation system. And there is several reports of Guillain-Barré syndrome and other peripheral nerve disorders associated. But acute disseminated encephalomyelitis associated with COVID-19 is rather a rare immune-mediated demyelinating disorder. It usually presents as an acute encephalopathy with neurological deficits, with MRI features consistent with multifocal demyelination. Usually it happens as a post-infectious or immune-mediated complication. And there are several case reports. The first case report, however, was in March 2020 from Wuhan, where a patient who was admitted with COVID-19 developed acute onset flaccid myelitis with bowel and bladder involvement, and he had a sensory level. However, in this case, there is no MRI or CSF findings that was done. However, subsequently there are many case reports, including in May there is a case report from Italy where a patient was found presented actually with acute encephalopathy, but she was tested positive for COVID-19, and her imaging showed multi-level demyelination. Again, this is another case report that is from France. She also is a 4-year-old lady. She presented with acute demyelination. So here there was again evidence of multi-level demyelination, which is initially thought to the other differential considered possibility of than a small multi-level demyelination was small vessel vasculitis causing a similar finding. This another case report that was that had come out in June 2020. A man who presented with mild ILI and was admitted, who developed acute onset quadriparesis. He developed cervical the transverse myelitis subsequently. What was mainly noted was all these patients, when we look at the News2 score or the severity of the respiratory infection or the respiratory distress, there is no the disease is either asymptomatic, mild, or in few cases moderate illness. So it doesn't correlate at all with the disease, the ARDS that has been produced by the virus. This is a case series that was published in June. So they've reported 3 cases from the US. All the patients they had severe COVID-19, and they developed after prolonged ICU stay, like into the 3rd and 4th week of the illness. All 3 of them were requiring ICU stay with mechanical ventilation. They developed features. One lady presented with developed paraplegia, and other lady presented with acute encephalopathy, and they had shown multi-level demyelination with transverse myelitis and different levels of demyelination in the cerebral white matter. So they were able to demonstrate mildly elevated protein levels in the CSF with insignificant cell counts, and they had tested the COVID PCR in the CSF them, and was found to be negative in this all three patients. They were treated. All of them were treated with IV pulsed steroids for 5 days, and 2 of them required IVIG. One patient had expired following even after the treatment, did not improve. 2 other patients had significant improvement in terms of neurological dysfunction. However, there was no full recovery. So what are the possible pathogenesis here? Is it direct viral invasion? Because we know that...
Can you summarize your this thing? I think you overshot the time.
Yeah. So it could be a post-infectious inflammatory reaction or a direct viral invasion. And we know that interleukin 6 has been shown to be associated with demyelination, and the cytokine storm in the disease can be a part of the pathogenesis. About this patient, summarizing, he had developed, since he did not have a significant improvement after pulsing, he was started on IVIG therapy. However, he had sudden onset desaturation with hypotension, which was thought to be either IVIG anaphylaxis or a new sepsis, because he just completed his the pulsing. The IVIG was discontinued, and he was started on meropenem. He had leukocytosis, deranged LFT, and subsequently he is currently better with the antibiotic therapy, and he is planned for continuing the same treatment, and planned for plasma exchange once the infection is settled. So concluding, the understanding of neurological disease with COVID-19 is definitely evolving, and we should continue monitor patients closely for neurological disease. And cases like a focal neurological deficit or global encephalopathy, a possibility of ADEM should be considered with or without vascular stroke syndromes. Possible pathogenesis in demyelination she needs further exploration, and like in this case, the choice of immunomodulation is in a dilemma, and we need to have further data and experience with the same. I request, I really thank Dr. Anand Zakaria and Dr. Ajit sir, Dr. Ginny ma'am from geriatrics, and Dr. Vivek Matthew from neurology, and Dr. Angel from neurology. She is presenting a few slides on CMC experience and neurological manifestations of COVID-19. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go without the slideshow. So summarizing this patient, this is a 62-year-old gentleman with a SARI presentation of COVID. Some interesting things about this patient is he's quite early into illness. He developed a hyperacute to acute myelopathy. He did have elevated inflammatory markers and D-dimer, and he has involvement of the brainstem, mainly the pons, middle cerebellar peduncle, and he has got a longitudinally extensive transverse myelitis. There is no leptomeningeal enhancement, and the brain imaging is actually fairly consistent with the inflammatory demyelination. So based on the diffusion weighted image, and which showed areas of peripheral areas of restricted diffusion, and the contrast imaging also showed some peripheral areas of enhancement in especially the lesion involving the middle cerebellar peduncle. The spine imaging is also consistent with an inflammatory demyelination. However, other possibilities are vascular insult due to thrombosis. The CSF protein was elevated, and CSF sugars are normal. So our differentials here are either it's a vascular etiology, whether it's a spinal artery syndrome or an APLA, infection, ADEM, or NMOSD. So the queries to be answered in this case are: what is the standard of care in a post or a para-infectious CNS inflammatory demyelinating disorders, and how could the pathophysiology in this case be different, and what are the possible ways to get insights into the same, and what could be the treatment options? So what we are seeing is the spectrum of post-infectious inflammatory disorders are ADEM, fulminant ADEM, can be acute hemorrhagic leukoencephalitis, or ANEC, acute necrotizing encephalopathy of childhood, and infection-associated NMOSD. So the differences classically are: NMOSD is traditionally a humoral mediated immune response to IgG antibody. It involves an autoimmune astrocytopathy. It usually the water channels are targeted, and there is some evidence of complement activation as well. In ADEM, what we see is a perivenular demyelination. It's usually patchy and it's multifocal, involves the T and B cells, and there's a scant plasma cell infiltrate as well. So what is the treatment recommendation? Usually steroids are given 500 to 1000 milligram for 5 days. It's unlikely to have an optimal benefit if the initial disability is severe. And in NMOSD, plasma exchange can be started as early as 3 days. At times, the wait of 7 to 15 days to assess response to steroids is recommended, and usually up to 2/3 respond well. And the response dramatically declines if the plasma is initiated after 2 months. So optimal plasma exchange consists of 3 to 7 sessions, alternate day for 14 days. And IVIG can be considered if there is a suboptimal response to plasma or steroids, or if they are contraindicated and not available. That is also based on anecdotal reports. Rituximab is added to prevent relapses. It's a steroid sparing agent. So in ADEM acute treatment, we do not have RCTs. So the level of class of recommendation, level of evidence is poor. But of course, steroids are the standard of care. IVIG can be added at the beginning with steroids in severe cases, and plasma can be considered for refractory cases. In those which are refractory to all three, cyclo and rituximab have been tried as an induction therapy. So the pathophysiology in COVID myelopathy, so far there have been 5 cases reported worldwide. So all of them they've given as inflammation versus a thrombosis, which is the endothelial dysfunction with angiopathy. So in contrast to other viruses like H1N1 dengue, there is a tendency for neurotropism with viral invasion into CNS associated with a hyperinflammatory response, which can occur only in the CNS or isolated in the CNS also has been documented. So what are the tests which can be done in this patient which could provide further insights into the pathogenesis? CSF RT-PCR. So in all the 5 previously reported cases, the RT-PCR has been negative. And serum CSF antibody titers with serial rise in titers, which can say that the immune response is actually setting in, which is causing this damage. And serum and CSF inflammatory markers. So we actually try to get this. IL-6 is now available as a testing for everyone. So we actually wanted to do the IL-6 levels in this patient. So before we pulsed him with steroids, we took the blood and the CSF sample. So it's interesting to note that the serum IL-6 was only 11.6 and his CSF level was 2762. So the inference is likely the IL-6 is actually produced in the CNS itself rather than it being a systemic inflammatory response which is crossing over the blood-brain barrier. So tocilizumab in neurology, we know tocilizumab is an anti-IL-6 monoclonal antibody. So there is evidence of relapse prevention in NMO and refractory autoimmune encephalitis. However, the concerns are it has a low CSF penetration with high superinfection rates, and transient rise in IL-6 due to receptor blockade could result in exacerbation of the disease itself, and effect not immediately seen in cytokine storm, cytokine release syndromes, and it needs repeated dosing. And of course, in our setting, the cost is an issue. So the current concerns with this patient, there's initial improvement in bulbar functions, but still continues to be paraplegic. Plan was to give him a tapering schedule of steroid, add on IVIG, but he developed sepsis. So we need to wait till the sepsis is sorted out. He probably has a component of upper airway edema as well, secondary to the IVIG anaphylaxis. Or he could have also progressed, developed new lesions, and he has also developed bed sores. There are multiple setbacks. He is unlikely to have any diaphragmatic involvement because initial cord pathology was from C6 level. So the bulbar might take some time to improve. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim and Angel. I remember this patient when he came to the ward early morning. He was not able to move both his lower limbs when he got up from that time. One of the concerns we had was it was so acute that last night he was well and morning he was not able to move both the lower limbs. We were wondering whether it was a vascular event, whether there was a spinal artery occlusion, and other concern was whether he had a aortic dissection, but the peripheral pulses were well present. And after that we proceeded on to see if he's got a demyelinating, and the MRI showed features of demyelination. Any other questions, comments? Thank you. We'll move on to the next presentation, the bone ultimatum by Sanuj.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is a story of Mr. K, 60 years old gentleman, a weaver from Kanchipuram. He had presented to us with sudden onset weakness of the left side of the body since one day and slurring of speech since one day. He was trying to get up in the bed in the afternoon when he noticed that he was unable to move the left side of his body, with the weakness being maximal at onset. This was associated with slurring of speech. There is no history of seizures, bowel or bladder incontinence, no history of fever, headache, vomiting or loss of consciousness. He was initially treated at a local hospital and later referred to CMC. By this time his weakness had significantly improved. He has no known comorbidities, and he is a reformed ethanol consumer and tobacco chewer. So with this history, we went on to the examination. He was conscious and oriented to the GCS of 15/15. He had tachycardia, pulse of 108, which was irregular with variable volume, no radioradial or radiofemoral delay. Blood pressure was 140/86, respiratory rate of 17. He was afebrile. He had no pallor, cyanosis, clubbing, lymphadenopathy or edema, and JVP was not elevated. Going into the systemic examination, especially the CNS, the characteristic points here are that he had normal higher mental functions. He had deviation of the mouth to the right side, decreased left side nasolabial fold, forehead wrinkles were present on both sides. He had absent gag on the left and uvula deviated to the right with dysarthria. He had a power of 4+/5 on the left and 5/5 on the right. Other systemic examination was unremarkable, other than the fact that left-sided deep tendon reflexes were exaggerated. Plantar reflex was equivocal on the left and downgoing on the right. The rest of the CNS examination was unremarkable. Cardiovascular examination was significant that he had.
Only the audio is working. So, I use my.
Can you hear now, sir? Can you hear now? Sir, can you hear now? Can you hear now, sir?
Yes, Anuj, we can hear.
Okay, okay. So cardiovascular examination was significant with S1, S2 heard with a loud P2. Apex was shifted outward in the mid-axillary line in the fifth intercostal space. There was grade 2 mid-diastolic murmur with opening snap heard in the apex with patient in the left lateral position. There was no carotid brewing. Respiratory examination, he had normal vesicular breath sounds with bilateral equal air entry. He had soft non-tender abdomen with no organomegaly on palpation. So summarizing, we have a 60-year-old gentleman with no known comorbidities who presented to us with a left-sided hemiparesis with left UMN facial palsy due to a probable cardioembolic stroke affecting the right hemisphere in the MCA territory, secondary to a valvular heart disease, mitral stenosis based on the examination findings with atrial fibrillation with a fast ventricular rate. So this looks like a typical stroke patient, a stroke episode presenting to us. But that is just the icing on the cake, and the story does not end here. So based on this, we did some baseline investigations, most of which were normal, but a significant finding was that when we looked into the liver function test, because he had a history of ethanol consumption, his alkaline phosphatase was found to be significantly elevated, 1157 versus ALP level. And he had no other significant complaints. I mean, with respect to, he had with respect to the history and examination, he had nothing suggestive of hepatitis, alcoholic hepatitis, or a bone-related issue at that point. But we needed to find out whether it was a hepatobiliary pathology or a bone-related pathology. So we went ahead and did a GGT, which was found to be normal. So definitely a bone-related pathology at this point. HbA1c was also done, which was found to be 5, and hence diabetes also was ruled out in this patient. So we did a CT non-contrast of the brain at arrival because he had presented with a stroke. It showed an acute infarct in the right MCA territory involving the lateral frontal lobe. So that explains his presentation, CNS presentation. But what it also found is diffuse expansion of cranial bones, also with the skull base with areas of lysis and sclerosis. So both happening at the same time, lysis and sclerosis. So because of this presentation, we went ahead and did a calcium and phosphorus. And calcium was found to be elevated in him, 10.97, phosphorus being normal, borderline normal. So now completing the workup for the stroke, we went ahead and did an echo, which found mild MS, MR, AR, and TR with pulmonary hypertension, normal LV systolic function, LVH, and no left atrial or left atrial appendage clot. Mitral valve had thickened AML, restricted mobility of PML with calcification, and aortic valve also had calcific leaflet edges. So the things that are highlighted are eventually pointing to something at the diagnosis. So just do keep a note of that. Carotid artery Doppler was also found to be normal in him. So with this presentation of lytic and sclerotic lesions, we had a few differentials in mind and went back to the history. So he didn't have any history of altered behavior, abdominal pain, no history of renal calculi in the past, no history of any fractures, no history of cardiac disease during childhood, no history of recurrent infections, and no history of decreased urine output. So at this point, the differentials that we considered with this lytic and sclerotic lesions with hypercalcemia, so multiple myeloma, but sclerotic lesions in poems, but otherwise both occurring together is less likely. Metastatic malignancy, Paget's disease of the bone can have both lytic and sclerotic lesions, but hypercalcemia is unlikely here. Primary hyperparathyroidism, lytic and sclerotic lesions are unlikely, hypercalcemia yes. Osteomalacia is associated with hypocalcemia, but can have bone lesions. Osteosarcoma can have lytic sclerotic lesions, but hypercalcemia is unlikely. Drugs, thiazide diuretics can cause hypercalcemia, but not lytic sclerotic lesions. Then familiar hypocalciuric hypercalcemia. That generally does not tend to cause lytic and sclerotic lesions. So this was a bit of a problem here because no one condition is explaining both these presentations. So we worked up for the hypercalcemia because further increase would lead to distress for the patient. So we wanted to treat the hypercalcemia initially and find out what the cause is. So this was the algorithm that we followed for finding out the cause of hypercalcemia. So measure the intact PTH. If it's elevated, primary hyperparathyroidism. Mid to normal PTH, it's primary hyperparathyroidism is likely, or it could be familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia. If low normal or low PTH, then consider vitamin D deficiency, humoral hypocalcemia of malignancy. Other possibilities are lymphoma. If vitamin D is elevated, vitamin D intoxication. If not, work up for serum electrophoresis, look for multiple myeloma, or for other causes like hyperthyroidism. So in this patient, with this approach, we went ahead and found that the PTH was elevated, vitamin D was normal, serum electrophoresis was normal, TSH was normal, 24-hour urine calcium was 326 milligram. Normal ranges have been put in brackets, and the calcium creatinine clearance ratio was 0.036. So value greater than 0.02 essentially excluded familial hypocalciuric hypercalcemia. Further investigations led to an ultrasound of the neck showing a lesion suspicious for adenoma, and so we went ahead and did a parathyroid scintigraphy, probable left inferior parathyroid adenoma. Bone mineral density was suggestive of osteoporosis. Technetium-99 bone scan suggestive of Paget's disease of the bone. X-rays, we did a skeletal survey, showed lytic and sclerotic lesions in the upper and lower limbs. And on discussion with the radiologist, there were presentation of osteopenia also in the vertebral bones and the humerus. So this is the X-ray picture of this patient. This the one on the left is the right femur, and the one on the right is a scout image of the CT scan. So what we see is a typical presentation that is seen in classical presentation that is seen in Paget's disease of the bone, which is the blade of grass sign. So if you can see here, I hope you can see the mouse. You can see that this area looks like a blade of grass. So this is a characteristic presentation seen in Paget's disease of the bone. And in Paget's disease of the bone, both osteoclastic and osteocytic activity, osteoblastic activity are on the higher side. And that is confirmed with the PINP and beta cross-lab. PINP indicates increased osteoblastic activity, and beta cross-lab indicates increased osteoclastic activity, both being elevated. So Paget's disease of the bone was more or less confirmed here. And we look into the CT images. We this is where we found out that the patient had lytic and sclerotic lesions. You can see the diploic space is being widened here. This is because of lytic lesions here, and there is some sclerosis also forming over here. So both lesions happening at the same time. So considering the presence of both hypercalcemia with elevated PTH and an adenoma, we considered a diagnosis of a coexistence of primary hyperparathyroidism with Paget's disease of the bone. Now this has been reported in several case reports, starting from 1934, first reported by Albright, and by 2008 there were about 90 case reports of the same, and by now there would have been more than 200. So this is Paget's disease itself is a rare disease, and this association with Paget's and primary hyperparathyroidism per se is even rarer. So this is a rare condition and a rare presentation, especially in this population. In this population, because Paget's disease per se is less common in the Asian population as compared to the Western population. Now, to look at these, we'll just look at these diseases separately, and then try and figure out how this patient got landed up with a stroke to us with no known comorbidities. Now, primary hyperparathyroidism is usually associated with solitary adenomas in 80% of patients. Most are asymptomatic. Classical presentation is bone stones, abdominal moans, and psychic groans. Osteitis fibrosa cystica is a bone manifestation, which is rare now. Nephrolithiasis associated with calcium oxalate stones with renal calculi. The abdominal problems are associated with nausea and constipation, and psychic groans are because of lethargy, depressed mood, psychosis, decreased social interaction, and cognitive dysfunction. Now, this is some radiological signs seen in primary hyperparathyroidism. I see that the radial margins of proximal and distal phalanges are frayed, irregular, and lace-like because of subperiosteal resorption. And as you can see with the at the arrowhead, we can see osteolysis, we can see the resorption and what is called as the brown tumor. which is cystitis fibrosa, osteolysis fibrosa cystica, and osteolysis of the distal phalanges. So in our patient, we wanted to see was this cardiovascular manifestation a result of primary hyperparathyroidism. So there have been multiple case reports of primary hyperparathyroidism associated with cardiac abnormalities, and especially in this patient because he had no other comorbidities to cause a stroke. There are two major case reports that were described cardiac manifestations, cardiac abnormalities in patients with primary hyperparathyroidism, and effect of chronic hypocalcemia on the heart. So what these case reports eventually tell us that primary hyperparathyroidism can be associated with hypertension, which is common even in patients without multiple endocrine neoplasia. LVH and diastolic dysfunction is also a common presentation in primary hyperparathyroidism. And the previous two studies that I had mentioned also mentions vascular and valvular calcification and arrhythmias, both of which were present in our patient here. He had calcification of the mitral and aortic valve, and he had an arrhythmia. So this is looking into the study and the presentation of calcification and follow-up post-parathyroidectomy. So when we look into this this table, we see that both aortic and mitral valve had calcification. Aortic about 40% and mitral valve about 35%, about 30%. And post-surgery, 41 months of follow-up post-surgery, we see that the calcification has not worsened, which means that the etiology could have been primary hyperparathyroidism over here, which led to the calcification of the valve. So diagnosis is by checking the calcium, then workup for calcium, PTH, 24-hour urine calcium, vitamin D, renal imaging, and bone mineral density to rule out osteoporosis, because primary hyperparathyroidism is a risk factor for the same. So treatment would be surgical removal of parathyroid adenoma, calcium mimetics, and bisphosphonates for the osteoporosis. Now looking into Paget's disease, usual onset is after 55. Men are more prevalent than women.
Anuj, can you just summarize your this?
Yeah. So this is rare in Indian context and more present in the Western countries. Usually asymptomatic. The usual way we diagnose Paget's disease is by chance finding of radiographical images, or because we did calcium for some other reason not related to Paget's disease. So that is the same situation in our patient. Most of the cases would have multiple polyostotic diseases, mostly involving the pelvis, vertebra, femur, and they can have bowing deformities, fracture of phalangetic bone, and osteosarcoma very rarely. So diagnosis again, radiological, clinical and lab findings. Serum alkaline phosphatase is significantly elevated, like in our patient. Serum osteoblastic and osteoclastic markers are elevated. Bone biopsy only in monostotic lesions, but otherwise not necessary. Bone scintigraphy and skeletal survey. And treatment for the same would be bisphosphonates and calcitonin. Bisphosphonates, zoledronic acid being the most efficient one among the bisphosphonates. So in our patient, he is currently under follow-up with endocrinology and endocrine surgery. He is planned for initiation of bisphosphonates and he is under surgical evaluation also. Deficits have almost resolved and he is on anticoagulation at present in view of the atrial fibrillation. So the take-home messages from this slide are, from this presentation are: approach to hypercalcemia and diagnosis of primary hyperparathyroidism. Primary hyperparathyroidism can cause cardiac abnormalities, including valvular calcification and eventually arrhythmias. And primary hyperparathyroidism can be a risk factor for osteoporosis and fractures. Lytic and sclerotic lesions on bone imaging in the elderly. Consider the coexistence of Paget's disease of bone with primary hyperparathyroidism if calcium is elevated. Clinical, radiological, and biochemical findings in Paget's disease. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanuj. Any comments or questions? We'll close the presentation now because we overshot the time. The last two presentations, I think, can be postponed to next week. Thank you all for your presentations, well presented. Request to the registrars from next week onwards, kindly stick to time when you're presenting. Please stick to 8 minutes while you are presenting. Thank you. I think we'll close for today.